Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for my delay in getting here. Senator Markey was giving his, what is still referred to in 2013 as his maiden speech. Someday we'll change that, on the floor of the United States Senate, and I wanted to be there for it. But I've read your testimony, and what I wanted to start with is back in January when Congress provided $50 billion in funding for Hurricane Sandy recovery. We all know it's important to spend the money wisely, and it means thinking long-term, not just rebuilding, but updating our housing supply so it's better able to withstand bad weather conditions, modernizing the electric grid, our communications system. So that's why I was pleased to see the recommendations. Many of them have a very long-term focus, and the recommendations in the Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Strategy Report released last month takes this long-term approach. Now, the next step, of course, and perhaps the more challenging one, is executing on the recommendations. So, Secretary Donovan, the question I have is that the report explains that agencies will be monitored and held accountable if they do not follow the recommendations of the report. But the interagency task force that drafted the report will be disbanded soon. So who exactly will be monitoring the agency's performance after that?
You're looking at him. I am going to continue leading this effort with the assistance of Craig Fugate. Mm-hmm. We will be convening on a monthly basis all of the key agencies that have been part of the task force to track implementation. I will not give you the thick stack of implementation plans we've developed for every one of the 69 recommendations and the tracking process. We have a project management office that we set up that's going to continue in existence and be part of the FEMA office in the region that's tracking it. And I will be convening the entire cabinet that's engaged on a quarterly basis to make sure that we have the full attention of the cabinet with the assistance of Dennis McDonough and Elizabeth Mastromonaco, who have been deeply involved in this process. So I believe we have a full strategy to make sure that the strategy is implemented, but I look forward to you and your colleagues holding our feet to the fire to make sure that happens as well.
Good.
I might just weigh in, Senator Warren.
Please.
We at the DOT are one of those agencies who will be part of that process. It has really already started. We are already about the business of reporting to the successor of the task force, if you will, in terms of what progress we're making. And it is a very productive interagency relationship. So I'm very optimistic that this report is not just going to get stuck on a shelf.
Well, I'm very glad to hear this, and very glad to hear that you've got strong implementation plans, not only in place, but that they've actually started. Can I ask the other part of the question, though? And that is, how will the agencies be held accountable if they fail to follow the report's recommendations?
So obviously that depends on the specific recommendation. But generally speaking, what I would say is this is something the president is watching. He included the work of the Sandy Task Force as a central element in his climate action plan, looking at how we make our regions more sustainable, more resilient going forward. He created a working group to take many of these recommendations to a national level, infrastructure resilience guidelines and other things. And so ultimately, this is a question that we will be watching, and there will be clear consequences from whether it's a call from me, a call from the president, if those recommendations are not being carried forward.
All right, and I take it you will also be public about recommendations that are not being carried forward, as well as those that are.
We are currently reporting on a regular basis, now monthly, all of the spending of the supplemental dollars. And we will be tracking, we'd be happy to share with you, implementation of the milestones in a very clear way through this project management.
Great. And just one more while I'm trying to make sure I've got all of this. If any of the agencies are lag behind in spending their allowed or allocated funds. Will you also be tracking that, and will they be held accountable?
This is the data that we've started to publish now on HUD's website for the public on a monthly basis. One of the things that's important here, Congress did for the first time ever put in the supplemental a 24-month requirement for each of the spending categories. That is something that we have worked very closely with all the agencies to make sure that where, for example, we have long-term transit that will clearly take beyond 24 months, that we provide a provisional waiver, but still subject to spending deadlines. But the majority of the funding will still be subject to the 24-month. And so you've given us a tool that will allow us to hold agencies accountable as well.
Well, this is really good to hear, and I appreciate it. You know, after the flooding of the Mississippi River in 1993 and after the Hurricane Katrina in 2005, there were reports issued with detailed recommendations, and then very few of those recommendations were actually implemented. So when I see good recommendations, I really want to know that we're going to follow through and make sure that they're there. So thank you. Mr. Chairman, could I have your indulgence to ask one more question? I know I'm over time. Good. So I have a second one that I wanted to ask about, and that is, of course, as you know, New Jersey and New York bore the brunt of Sandy's impact, but other coastal states were hit hard as well. In Massachusetts, for example, the storm caused flooding on the coastline, on the islands. It damaged facilities at Hanscom Air Force Base, at Cape Cod Air Force Station. So the question I have is, based on your experience with Sandy, what do you both think could be done to prevent or mitigate the impact of future coastal storms? Whoever would like to start. Secretary Donovan?
I would say, first of all, the emphasis and the structure of the funding that was in the supplemental has given us a head start on that. Resilience, mitigation were key parts of the strategy that for the supplemental the president proposed and that was passed, and we are implementing that in many, many ways. I think the single place to start is to make sure that communities have the information, the science that they need to be able to make the right decisions. And so that is why we talked a little bit earlier with Senator Menendez about the FEMA flood maps, updating those, but also we provided for the first time through the task force a tool that allows communities, individual homeowners, businesses to access information up to 100 years into the future about what sea level is expected to be. And we have, for the first time, incorporated across the entire supplemental guidelines that say we have to look at, not particularly for infrastructure, not just current flood risk, but future flood risk. And so that is the first time we've ever done it. We're now looking at expanding that nationally as part of the President's Climate Action Plan.
Can I follow up to that by just asking, have you considered developing a coastal storm strategy that would permit federal, state, and local officials to better coordinate their weather management and address infrastructure and zoning differences?
Yes, and in fact, first of all, we now have the best science available because of the work of the task force. That's a critical piece of the information you're talking about. Thanks to the supplemental, the Army Corps of Engineers is doing a full study from Virginia up to Maine of both natural and kind of hard infrastructure and what should be done. We're collaborating closely with them on that strategy. And then the third thing I would point out, we have convened a competition, which is going to use some of the Sandy supplemental money. We got 150 teams, 148 to be exact, from over 15 countries that are now competing. We've chosen 10 finalists that are looking to propose really innovative, cutting-edge approaches in a set of places across the region. And so we think that's a way, not just in terms of science and a broad approach, but also with very, very innovative projects to bring the best thinking from around the world to the region that can be models for what we do in other places.
And you will be developing plans to do this so that it's regional but we're also picking up the state governments in this and our municipal governments.
We are
all along the
partnering
shore.
very closely, and we're not just going to develop the plans. We're going to build the infrastructure as a result of this competition.
That's terrific.
Senator Warren, if
Yes,
I could
please.
just add very briefly three quick thoughts. First, on response and recovery, we did actually at the Federal Transit Administration provide a comparatively very small grant to the MBTA based on the costs that they did encounter. And while, as we said earlier in the hearing, the resiliency funds, which we will now be putting out, is centrally focused on protecting the infrastructure that was destroyed, transit agencies throughout the states that did have a disaster declaration, which included Massachusetts, are eligible to participate. I think importantly, going forward, we actually, a year before Hurricane Sandy hit, put out a report about the impacts of climate change on transit infrastructure, which is getting a lot of attention, thankfully, by the planning community as we make plans going forward for future investments. One quick anecdote that I keep being reminded of in this incident. I was at, I'm not going to say where, but I was at a dedication of a new bus facility. And the general manager of the transit agency was telling me how cheaply they got the property to locate this new facility. And when I pressed him on why, he explained, well, it's in the floodplain, and we're municipal government, so we can locate here while everyone else can't.
God.
And all I could think of is, well, perhaps that's true, but I'm not sure you should. And I think that's an important element here, is to the extent that public assets, public transit assets, or public housing assets are asked to take the less valuable property, and that less valuable property is vulnerable, we're not serving the taxpayer well that subsidizes those elements, and we're certainly not serving the transit users or the tenants well. So we need to sort of maybe change the dialogue here in terms of who gets protected property versus that which is most vulnerable.
Good. Well, I thank you both very much, and really appreciate your looking at this as a coastal storm strategy that we have to develop together and use a lot of long-term planning on it. I appreciate the approach here. And as you said, we're going to hold you to it. Thank
Good.
you.